during that time, and that was probably the second tragedy of the Congo after the slave trading. In 1908, King Leopold lost Belgium because he had contracted a lot of debt from the Belgian government and other parties, and he became unable to pay them back. So, and he had to literally give up the colony to the kingdom now, to Belgium, and the Congo, which was called the Congo Free State, then became the Belgian Congo. And in 12 years later, the first Congolese protest movement started against colonization. And that ended 40 years later, the protest movement, when Congo finally gained their independence. But unfortunately, the big, industry, the mining industry, the natural resource industry, was still in the hands of the colonizers. Now, Patrice Lumumba, who became the first prime minister of the Congo, was a very charismatic leader, and Joseph Kasavubu, was in the black and white photo here, became president, but he was less charismatic. So he was more on the soft side of the spectrum, where he wanted to carry on having a relationship with Belgium, but Lumumba wanted total cut and wanted the Congo to take back control of the resources. Unfortunately, that didn't go very well for Lumumba. A year later, after becoming prime minister, he was arrested and killed. And there has been it's been suggested that there's been involvement of intelligence services from Belgium, France, and America and Britain involved in the assassination of Lumumba. Immediately after he was assassinated, some years later, Mobutu took over the power and remained in power for 32 years. Now, in 1970, Mobutu changed the name of the country. It went from Congo to become Zaire. I was born in Zaire and then became Congolese in 1997 when when Zaire changed name to become Congo again. And during all that time, during that 32 plus years of Mobutu, he basically did the same as what King Leopold did, which means he used the natural resources of the country to make allies and to also use it against his enemy that could not have access to the resources. So, Mobutu falls in 1996, and Laurent Desire Kabila took over the power. That's probably about when the third tragedy of the Congo started, because when Kabila took the power, he came in, he had a political objective, which was to reach the capital and take over Mobutu's seat at the presidency. Now, in 2001, when he is killed and his son Joseph Kabila takes over the power, at the same time, a lot of other armed groups started to breed, especially in the eastern part of the Congo. Most of those armed groups had no political objectives, and none of them has even taken or undertaken to walk down to the capital and take over the power. So political objective for the war started to shift more for mineral resources. And that's the beginning of the tragedy of what is called conflict mineral in 2000, a little bit earlier than 2001, but at about that period. So armed groups started to fight more for having access to mineral resources. And in 2007, after the first elections, the price of the metal known as cobalt started to skyrocket because of the increased need in what was by then started to being developed, electrical vehicles. Copper and cobalt went very high, and that drove a lot of people into the mining industry, not only the big industry, but also people working with what is called today artisanal and small-scale mining, which is basically people digging by hand and processing mineral and selling concentrate mineral. Now, not all the mines that were producing it were producing it ethically. I've earlier mentioned already conflict mineral. Most of it is produced artisanally, so dug by hand. Cobalt became also a very important commodity for artisanal and small-scale mining. In 2010, countries started to take measure about how to remove from the market those metals or raw material that are not produced ethically. So the United States started with what is called the Dodd-Frank Act, which aimed to prevent American companies to buy what is called conflict mineral from the eastern part of the Congo. And lately, Europe also followed with what is called the conflict mineral regulation, with basically the same objectives. This is a typical artisanal and small-scale mining. You can see how chaotic it is. In 2018, some Congolese leaders also took a stand against, first of all, conflict mineral, but also what is called gender-based violence, because there are a lot of women who are suffering a lot in those mines and in the war that is ongoing, the war for control of minerals. And in 2018, a Congolese doctor was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his involvement in that fight against conflict mineral and gender-based violence. And he had been advocating a lot since a very long time for including rape as a weapon of mass destruction, because literally many of those armed groups that are fighting in the Congo, some of them were actually using it to destroy the society. In 2019, there's been new election in the Congo, and the Congo also started to work with international partners to also implement some sort of regulation similar to what is called the Dodd-Frank Act in America, and the conflict mineral regulation in Europe, to have something similar in the Congo. That work is still ongoing, but in any case, the Congo also took a stance for that and decided that it was about time also to implement something to protect people from exploitation and from conflict, from being victim of conflict mineral, and to literally remove armed group from mineral trade routes. And also to formalize the small-scale mining sector. I will talk a bit more about formalizing the small-scale mining sector. Now, a bit of a summary before we go forward. So we talked a little bit about the pre-colonial time. Slave and cotton, that were the most sought commodity because of the textile industry. Colonial time, I talked about rubber, and that was mainly because of the automotive industry for making tires. Post-colonial, more base metals, because electrification was very important for industrialization, and the Congo had a lot of base metal and iron to provide to the world. And today, in current time, battery metals, very important for the energy transition. Again, Congo produces today about 6% of the cobalt, and about 70% of the reserve are estimated to be hosted in the Congo. So Congo has played, as you can see, a very important role in the development of technology, not only in the Congo, but at a global level. Now, how does the mining industry, the large-scale operation and small-scale operation looks like in the Congo? Well, in general, and also in the Congo. This is what we're going to be talking about next. Large-scale operations. So this is typically the way it looks like, big machineries, big trucks. The companies you typically focus on productivity and energy efficiency and safety. Now, when it comes to the business part itself, that's where some questions can be raised. How ethical companies are. We do know the mining industry to be a global industry. So typically, the same companies that produce raw material in Europe would also be, working in other parts of the world, including the Congo. But I've talked already about the issue of weak governance and strong governance countries. And it is not unusual that an ethical company will try to take shortcuts to have access to mineral resources by, giving bribes or trying to avoid laws, etc. So that's another side, another part, or avoids or trying to bend the legislation without necessarily breaking it, but trying to always be at the edge so that they can make as much profit as they can by paying the least possible. So large scale operation, um, if the company is ethical and you have a strong governance country, very low risk. On the other hand, weak governance country, and you have, in some way a doubtful company, very high risk. What about ecological sustainability? Well, in principle, any mining operation will probably always have some sort of negative pressure on the environment. Does take a lot of land, affects water, air, vibration, biodiversity. But nowadays, it is a lot more difficult to. So the way mining used to be done in the past has changed by quite a lot. But unfortunately, there is always that perception that the mining industry pollutes. But today, there would typically be an environmental impact assessment where a company would need to demonstrate how they will be taking care of the environment where they operate. And there typically would be a committee that would need a committee expert that would need to decide whether the impacts, the level of the impacts is acceptable or not. If acceptable, if impacts can be minimized and quite well controlled, then a large operation will go ahead. If not, probably disapproved. Economic sustainability. Well, mining operation will typically create jobs, lots of them at the same time, 100 or 1,000. Tax revenue, it provide money for the state. Infrastructure investments, roads, or the tax money can be for building, can help the government to build schools or to build hospital, etc. But risks, well, the commodity market is often volatile. We typically hear about commodity prices went high, next day it went down. That's very difficult to control. The jobs also, the job created are temporary as long as the mine runs. So very important to think about the aftermine. Expensive infrastructure investment for the states. So that can also be an issue. But there are some very good financial benefits. Social sustainability. Again, in brackets, if done right, create jobs. Development in the local area. There can be new opportunity for a new breed of entrepreneur to emerge when a mining operation starts. And the taxes can also be reinvested in local projects. The risks, and that's where if it's done incorrectly, conflicts between people, industry, and public sector. I've mentioned about the perception of the mining industry. So people are, in general, the general public would always be very skeptical because of the way mining used to be done in the past, and a lot of destruction of the environment has been left behind. Economic and social inequalities. So you end up in a society where you will have all those people working in the mine, earning a decent salary, but you also have a lot of people who will not necessarily work in the mine or will not be qualified to work in the mine. So you start creating some sort of social inequalities within the same society. Second, small-scale mining. I will first start with a description, and then I will be discussing two types of small-scale mining. So, small-scale mining, first of all, what it is? Well, it's basically people who work with hand tools without any machines to dig, process, and sell it. It is often uncontrolled and illegal in many countries, but nowadays there's a push for formalizing it. So it is also possible to see, people working, having a mining permit. Then they work under the protection of the laws and regulations. These are two images. Oops. So the top image is regulated mining, people with a permit. You can clearly see the difference. They're wearing their protective equipment. And down here, not at all. no protective equipment, and they are literally, sitting in the pit and digging in a very dangerous position. It's estimated that about 40 million people in the world work directly with small-scale mining, and if you add to that number their dependents, it's about 150 million. So it's a lot of people who are very dependent of small-scale mining. In some cases, the small-scale mining can be regulated, as I've mentioned, but in many other countries, it's not. It's typically family working together, and they will be sharing, responsibility. Typically, the man will be digging and carrying stuff and carrying material, and women and children will be, either washing or processing the ore before selling it. There are typically bad or negative environmental consequences. People usually become very sick because of, ingesting all the dusts full of heavy metals. So the health problems are quite regular or typical for people working in such environments. Workplace accidents also, mine collapse, quite common. Several workers are also often exploited because the people who are the people who sells the ore, who are usually middlemen, they usually buy the ore for a very low price and resell it for a higher price and makes the profit instead of the people working in the mine. Now the next question is good small-scale mining possible? Well, I will be in the next slide presenting a pilot project which is part of formalizing the small-scale mining sector in the Congo, where a small cooperative or small-scale miners have been assisted by government agency and technician and a NGO to develop a model small-scale mine where the legislation is respected and there is efforts to minimize impact of environment. The mine is called Mutoshi and they produce copper and cobalt. So first of all, mining permits. So they were literally given a permit with proper delimitation, an area that is delimited. They've got technicians that help them to map the ore body so that they don't have to dig everywhere, but only where they need to, and to design the galleries and the mine properly. The difference with unregulated mine is quite striking. On the right-hand side, it's very chaotic. People digging everywhere and washing the ore everywhere. It's difficult to know who there are even markets actually in some of those mines. Soil disturbance. In the first case, in the regulated mine, it's very controlled. You can see they have done some sort of area with some water ponds that they use to process the ore, which is basically just washing away the light mineral and keeping all the heavy mineral that's contain the metals in those bags that they're carrying. On the other side, washing the ore in a river, in a natural recipient, maybe in the same river on the other side, people are using this water to wash clothes, or maybe take water that they will use for cooking, and actually even kids working in the mine. Again, soil and water disturbance. The digging is quite well organized on the right-hand side. And they work in small groups, 3-4 people. On the other side, it's again very chaotic, just digging everywhere. The workforce, everyone is identified and they have protective equipment and they ensure no kids get into the mine. In a unregulated mine, well, there really are no limitations. There is no fence, there's no entrance. Anyone can get in, including kids or women with children working. The market. Well, the artisanal miners were assisted with equipment to do analysis so that they can know the value of what they sell and sell it to the right price. In unregulated markets, well, you basically have someone with a calculator deciding how much they're going to pay. And it can be the right value or not the right value at all. And someone may easily take advantage of the miners. This is another unregulated market. Social effect. Well, the assisted miners, they have social or community projects, which has actually helped some of them and still helping others to come out of poverty, really, because that is the main objective. And on the other side, well, people in regulated mining stands more chances or higher risk to remain in poverty for many years, never come out of it. Now, getting back to the slides that I show at the beginning, I will get back to it when we start the Q&A, but just start to think now about, how your own use of gadgets, for example, can affect the mine in the Congo. How does, for example, the Congolese government regulates the mining sector? Does it give you confidence that the raw material that you receive from the Congo are produced ethically? Because if you really if you think about it, and it's not easy, it's very difficult in the mining sector. If you buy a bottle of milk in the supermarket, it's very easy because you can read from which farm it comes from. But when you go and buy a cell phone, all the metals are together in your gadget, so you can't really know where it's coming from where. So the push that you can really make is toward the manufacturer. How do you ensure that the company selling you the cell phone is getting the raw material from a mine that's produced them ethically? So these are the sort of questions that one can start asking to themselves. Or can I stop using mining products and still maintain the same lifestyle? That's another interesting question too. And what happens if I stop consuming mining products? I think that was about it for myself. And I want to thank you everyone for listening. I will get back to this slide and I will be very happy to take any questions that you may have. So the floor is open for questions if you would have any.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right,
Loud
awesome.
and clear.
So first of all, obviously, just want to thank you for the awesome presentation.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Is small scale mining like can it be found everywhere in the world? And how can this be fixed? Like, what could be a solution to this?
Mm-hmm.
It does have very negative effects, but we can't just talk about them. You
Mm-hmm.
know, what could be a good resolution for it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And that was the point of showing that. So the question at the beginning when I started showing ISM was, okay, well, is it possible to do good small scale mining? And I think that pilot projects illustrate that there are definitely ways to improve that, because now with this new project, those people work in a more regulated way. They have access to geologists, they've got protective equipment, they minimize their use of water. They don't release water full of metals in the nature. So is there a way to do better small scale mining? I would say yes. But now, how much resources do we need? Quite a lot, because if you take a country like the Congo on its own, there is more than 500 known small scale mining. And according to experts, probably the same amount of unknown mine sites. Uh, so it may require a lot of resources to countries that do not necessarily have the financial resources. But now, how do you ensure that raw material are produced ethically? Well, maybe by partnerships between different interested parties, like the companies that buys the ore. Probably a good thing to talk to them. I mean, for those miners to get in touch with them and create some sort of platform when there can be a discussion. Does it exist all over the world? Well, there are some countries where small scale mining is formalized, so it is legal and regulated. There still are countries where small scale mining is illegal, and as such, there is no permit for small-scale mining. In most countries, people get involved in those countries where small-scale mining is a common activity. A lot of people get into that activity to, just come out of poverty, to have just enough money to feed themselves or send their children to school. Sometimes the children end up not going to school at all because they're also working in a mine. So it's a very difficult issue, but there are so many people working with that. I've mentioned 40 million directly involved and 150 millions dependent of those people. So deciding to just stop doing small scale mining will literally drive 150 million out of their regular activity and sink them in even a worse poverty situation. And that's why in countries like the Congo, instead of saying, okay, we're not going to do small scale mining, the approach has changed more towards, okay, we have this issue, this is the situation we have, how do we improve it? And that's why they've tried this pilot project, which is aimed to be replicated in all the mine sites. But yes, it will require a lot of time and a lot of resources, and it is not enough to just talk about it. Someone has to step in and take actions. Yeah, there are 2 more questions. I hope I've answered well to the question.
Yep, that was awesome. Thanks a
Yep.
lot.
Yeah, I see there's another hand up. Martina, please go ahead.
Hi. Well, I have a question.
Yep.
But the economic situation in Congo is better or worse respect the other African countries?
Well, if you use criteria that are defined by the OECD regarding what is a developed country or what is the country in development, the index for Congo is very low. I think we are in the bottom. I think Congo is in the bottom, if I'm not mistaken, bottom 20 countries or to bottom 15 countries. So it's a really, really tense financial situation. Most of the people working in small scale mining, as I've mentioned there, they really get involved into that to somehow feed themselves really, and just put food on their table and come out of poverty, which unfortunately, because of the lack of knowledge, they never really get out of poverty because they get abused by all the middlemen who never buy their product at the right price, and they end up living with a wage maybe of 1.5 or $2 a day, which, if you look at it, will never help anyone to come out of poverty. So it's a rather tense and difficult financial situation for those people involved in small scale mining.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Please feel free, just activate your microphone and ask your question. We still have another 11 minutes before 4. So there is still room for questions. There is a question in the chat now. Yes. How can we know where the minerals in our devices come from? Yes, very good question. So I've mentioned in the presentation the Dodd-Frank Act, which is the American legislation. There is also the Conflict Mineral Regulation, which is the EU regulation. So basically, what the regulation says is that those companies who are importing raw material from conflict-affected areas like the Congo, they must declare where the mineral comes from, so where the mine is, where it has been processed. If it has been already processed at a particular step, they need to have like some sort of certificate of origin, which is basically the documents that they get handed by responsible government agencies in the Congo. And if they do not have those documents that confirms that their products come from a mine that is, you know, a known mine that is audited and that is inspected by regulators in the Congo, normally they cannot import those raw materials. So now, if you think about metals like rare earth metals, for example, there aren't as much as them in a cell phone, for example. But we do know that 90% of rare earth metals, for example, is produced in China. So if you have rare earth metals in your phone, chances are, you know, it is produced in China. If you have a cobalt battery, we do know that 60% of cobalt comes from the Congo. So if you have cobalt battery in your cell phone, it most likely comes from the Congo. Again, the question is still, is the company from which you buy, do they comply with the legislation in the country where they produce their devices? There is a lot of push for, because in the US and the EU in particular, they've got their legislation, but we also know that most of the gadgets that we use, whether it is in Europe or in America, they are built in China, they are manufactured in China. And China does not have any legislation until today aiming to prevent conflict mineral to enter their market. So at the moment, there is a big push from all nations to get China involved also in the fight, because there is no point for, you know, Europe or America to have all this legislation in place, but then still buy the devices from China, which doesn't have that legislation. Because from the moment you already have a cell phone, it's almost impossible to know where it's come from. But if you go down at lower level, so at the level where the actual metal or the concentrate of the metal is produced, then you can still track down from which mine it comes from. From the moment it is in a cell phone, it's almost impossible. So it's more those companies at lower level of the production chain that have to take that responsibility. Let's put it that way. I hope I have answered well the question. Yeah, no. Okay, any other questions? You can also type it in the chat. So please feel free if you don't want to speak in the microphone. There's still another 7 minutes. We still have another 5 minutes. It can also be discussion. So if you would want to, you know, start a 5-minute discussion and I can contribute to your thoughts. Is there anyone who have had thoughts about how to improve small-scale mining? I know probably most of the things that we hear about it is quite negative things, but I think this pilot project has shown that it is really possible to improve the situation. It's not an easy task, but it is possible to somehow help out those communities living with ISM mining to come out of poverty. And if we take just the example of cobalt, because it's such an important metal today for producing electric vehicles and batteries, if you look at how much cobalt is produced yearly, it's about 120,000, and 60% of that comes from the Congo. And in that 60%, so that if you take the 100% of whatever cobalt that is produced in the Congo, 15% of it comes from small-scale mining. At the global scale, it represents about 8%. So if you take 60% of 120,000, we are talking about almost, 65,000 tons or 70,000. And if you take 15% of 70,000, it's a little bit more than 8,000 to 9,000 tons of cobalt that is produced from artisanal and small-scale mining. If you multiply it by the price of cobalt today, which is fluctuating between $42,000 to $45,000 per ton, you're already reaching numbers in hundreds of millions of dollars, which means if those artisanal miners were actually the one benefiting for the cash flow that is generated through artisanal and small scale mining, they would be able to come out of poverty. Now the question is how come during the past 20, 25 years, when they've been doing artisanal and small scale mining, they are not able to do so. And that's when you start to understand the scale of the problem.